We've only got 60 seconds to talk about how we're going to deal with that healthy food policy. The one about front of package labeling on food products. We need to get in on the decision making to protect our profits.
How do we get a seat at that table? We're food manufacturers, not health or policy experts.
We're stakeholders.
True. Well, they're proposing that octagonal warning label, you know? It's so simple, anyone can understand. Buyers will easily be able to identify ultra-processed products. They'll buy less of our stuff.
We should propose alternative labeling systems.
But the octagonal warning label is proven by scientific research to be the best. How do we counter that?
We can do our own studies. So we say we're supporting front of package labels, but push other less effective systems that won't hurt our profits.
Perfect. But we also need to deflect focus and keep public perception on our side.
A few donations here,
a few sponsorships there.
We'll look socially responsible while we're bringing in new customers.
So, greetings everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where the topic and discussion will be on policymaking and front package labeling. I'm Trevor Hassel, President of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. But first, a few observations. Today's webinar is titled, See the Truth. And there are several truths in the context of the prevention and control of obesity and NCDs in the Caribbean. The paramount truth is that it is widely recognized that obesity and NCDs inflict a significant health burden and an economic cost on Caribbean people, which requires effective health policies and legislations to bring about change. A further truth is that the failure to effectively manage the role and impact of the commercial sector on public health policy making within the context of the multi-sector response to obesity and NCDs is in fact the leading cause of weak responses in the Caribbean to obesity and the NCDs. This is due to weak governance mechanisms and failure to effectively manage conflict of interest to counter powerful economic actors in the region and beyond. Over the past several years, other truths have become increasingly apparent, which include the persistence of the unhealthy food and beverage industry in not only promoting and marketing to children, but also using children to market their products in contravention of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. A further truth is that the private sector has shown little interest in producing reformulated healthy products as had been hoped for, and the sector continues to oppose effective food labeling standards in which consumers are informed and empowered. The final in this introductory list of truths is that to fulfill the potential of commercial actors to be partners for health and well-being, it is essential to shift their practices from health harming to health promoting. This will be possible when there is potential for alignment between health and business models, products, and services of commercial actors. Shifting local commercial actors away from health harming and toward health promoting practices is a priority. I anticipate this is unlikely to occur until there's a shift in the power dynamics in the interests of public health through legislation, regulation, and policies. Many of these truths and several others will be discussed in some detail and highlighted by our speakers as the HCC's most recent campaign, See the Truth, is introduced during today's webinar. And so once again, a big welcome to everyone. And so I now invite Maisha Hutton Executive Director of the HCC, to provide a brief status update on the regional prepackaged labeling standards process. Maisha.
Thank you, Sir Trevor, and welcome again, everyone, to this webinar. Before I go ahead with the update, I wanted to provide a quick bit of housekeeping. We have the chat box enabled, so please use the chat to engage with each other and also engage with the panelists. The Q&A function is also active, so please also use this, and we will try to respond to your questions and comments in real time. We have a fantastic set of panelists today who will be sharing their expertise on this really important topic, so looking forward to hearing from them. But before that, I'm going to give you a quick update on where we are with the regional process. This is a snapshot of the entire process, which many of you know began in 2017. And 2018, the standard for labeling prepackaged foods, a decision was taken to revise it. And since 2018, we've been in consultations. In 2021, we had a vote, which failed at that time. And the standard went back out for regional consultations. And in October, we had a second vote, and we're currently awaiting the results of that vote. Over the course of the consultations, there's been significant opposition from the private sector. And this is a snapshot of the headlines we've seen over the past few years, really highlighting the significant opposition that we've seen from some actors in industry. And why have we had this opposition? Well, you know, it really comes down to this idea of power, and you're going to hear all about this today. You're going to hear about the industry playbook, the specific tactics that have been deployed by actors in the industry to undermine, to delay, dilute, and derail altogether policies, including the front of package warning labeling standards. You're also all going to hear about how weak governance has played a really critical role in providing entry points for industry interference, and how that has been a challenge not only at the national level, but at the regional level. So in terms of specific updates, CrossQ has a website, and there's a kind of a rolling update, which is provided every so often. The most recent update was provided on the 2nd of February. Essentially, the votes have been reviewed, and we are waiting on review by the regional project team and voluntary experts. And this should happen in the latter part of February, at which point we are hopeful that we will have an announcement from CrossQ updating the region on what the outcome of the vote was and the next steps. So I hope that that provides a quick update on where we are with the process. I'm now going to invite Tammy Marie, the consultant on the campaign See the Truth, to provide some more information on the campaign. Tammy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Maisha. So I'll get right to it. We recognize that the food and beverage industry is an important stakeholder for the effective implementation of healthy food policies. Take, for example, front of package warning labels. On one hand, they can be a crucial advocate and partner in achieving vital public health policy objectives. But on the other hand, they can deploy a wide range of tactics, practices, and arguments to weaken, delay, or even prevent advances in the healthy food policy space. See the Truth is a subtle request to the public and to our policymakers to acknowledge the realities behind industry interference and the harm it causes as a barrier to effective policy design or development and implementation. We also hope that it appeals to some actors in the food and beverage industry to take a closer look at their own actions and motives and the impacts that they have on the health and well-being of the Caribbean population. The truth is, we cannot address what we won't acknowledge or what we don't understand. And although similar interference strategies and tactics are used by tobacco, alcohol, breast milk substitutes, and other big industries, given the realities of working in small island developing states where the rules of engagement between public health and the private sector are a bit murky, conflicts of interest are commonplace, there is still a need to raise awareness and understanding around why we challenge and are trying to denormalize industry participation in the design of our healthy food policies and call for measures to safeguard the policymaking space from this kind of undue influence. So against this backdrop, the HCC and partners developed See the Truth, a campaign that hones in on key interference strategies and tactics deployed by some actors in the food and beverage industry during CARICOM's front of pack policy development process. The video which you saw at the beginning of the webinar features a hypothetical conversation between two industry actors and is really meant to highlight the constant, systematic, and sophisticated nature of the tactics deployed. And the 4 graphic cards that you see on screen were designed to succinctly debunk some of these tactics. Much like the background I've shared with you all today, the landing page provides context that may be too dense for social media materials, but efforts like this webinar and media coverage opportunities really allows us this opportunity to further expand on the negative impacts of industry interference tactics and discuss ways in which the food and beverage industry can have a more positive impact. Over to you, I think, Tia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's indeed a privilege to be here with you today and to be moderator of our next section, this panel discussion with our distinguished panelists who are all indeed experts in their respective fields. I'll take the opportunity now to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Arthur Phillips, who is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and the NCD focal point for the Barbados Ministry of Health and Wellness. We're also pleased to have Mrs. Nicole Foster, Law Lecturer and Head of the Law and Health Research Unit in the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus, and she's also the HCC Policy Technical Advisor. Thirdly, we're happy to welcome Mrs. Barbara McGaw, who is the Project Manager of the Global Health Advocacy Project for the Heart Foundation of Jamaica. We also have with us today Professor Alafia Samuels, the Honorary Professor of the Caribbean Institute for Health and Research at the University of the West Indies. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Shanique Bowden, who is the Executive Director of the Jamaica Youth Advocacy Network. We look forward to a robust discussion today. And to get that discussion rolling, I wanted to start with you, Dr. Phillips. Now, we know that the Barbados Ministry of Health and Wellness continues to be a strong supporter of octagonal warning labels and, of course, other evidence-based policies. And these include taxation on sugar-sweetened beverages, as well as the removal of sugar-sweetened beverages in schools. Now, the recent Barbados Declaration on NCDs and Mental Health, it speaks to commercial determinants of health as one of the major challenges for achievement of our NCD targets. I'm wondering from a public sector perspective, can you please elaborate on this and give us some examples?
Sure. So thanks very much for this opportunity to be part of the panel and to share. The commercial determinants of health, in a sense, just really reflect the fact that we are beings that respond to incentives, and the institutions that we create also respond to incentives and can initiate incentives to elicit other responses. Certainly in the process of trying to develop an evidence-based front of package labeling system for prepackaged foods, we have found that there were instances where the interactions reflected our understanding of commercial determinants. So that even as we were seeking to empower consumers and to advance health, there were interests that, based on commercial factors, were acting against this as they were pursuing their goals. On the other hand, we see that pursuit of commercial goals is not always anti-health. We've seen this in relation to the trans fat discussion and the ready agreement and the being fully on board with the agenda to eliminate trans fats from the global food supply and certainly the local food supply. But certainly in terms of the front of package labeling efforts, we've seen moves to cast doubt on scientific evidence, efforts to project potential WTO requirements as barriers or trade offenses, indicating that the costs of adding this important information would be unreasonably damaging to business. Even in terms of the assumptions around how do we get the legitimate stakeholders to the table, who is a legitimate stakeholder, and what are the roles in the process of policy making. We've seen commercial interests, we've seen interests at the table who are seeking things other than health benefit. So there seems to be a legitimacy and an ease of access to decision-making mechanisms that does not question the conflicts of interest of having industry advising on things even around the type and the meaning of health research evidence. And ultimately, these things that we've mentioned act to delay the achievement of informed and empowered consumers on the issues, including as they relate to healthy eating and ultimately to NCD risk. So those would be my initial comments in relation to your question. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share.
Yes, Arthur, I thought that was very interesting. And one of the things that you definitely brought out is how commercial actors seek to be involved and almost control the process of formation of health policies. And we know that this is one of the tactics that is deployed very often by commercial actors. They try to influence policies which regulate their products and services. And the claim is that they are stakeholders and thus they have to be involved in all of the stages of the policy making process. And this has emerged as one of the main challenges with this blanket multi-sectoral approach. Nicole, I think that this question would be great for you and a good follow-on to Arthur's statements. Can you please explain why and how this engagement might be limited to protect the integrity, of course, of the policy process?
Yes, thanks, Kia. And yes, absolutely. The idea is that, as Tammy said at the very beginning, there's an understanding that food industry is an important player, an important stakeholder in the process, but the question becomes what role should they play in policy making? And what is very clear is that based on one's policy objective, one then has to make determinations in terms of what is the level of engagement that one has. And certainly at the end of the day, the ultimate decision has to be made by government, because government is that player that is bringing all the interests on board and sort of hopefully providing a balanced outcome in line with the stated objective, which here we're very clear is a public health objective, right? And so the challenge that one sees is where one moves from a situation of input, of consultation, to actually being part of the decision-making process. And that creates a challenge because it opens up the opportunity for conflicts of interest. And we have seen, I mean, it's well established. We've seen, for example, in the tobacco realm, that under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, we understand that conflict of interest creates problems in terms of engagement with industry at that sort of deep level. And so we say, no, keep them at arm's length, even as we have conversations with them from time to time in terms of the impacts of proposed measures on their business and how they might want to maneuver, like how Sir Trevor was speaking about, potentially moving to more health neutral operations or reformulating in a food context, reformulating what you're doing. And we have seen in terms of the types of policies or the types of rules. I mean, certainly we should all have conflict of interest rules, right? We should all have policies that speak to, even as government, and particularly at the regional and national level when it comes to these types of processes, we should have conflict of interest policies that delineate okay, we are preserving this space though for the public health policymakers, and that is a sanitized space that does not allow them for those types of conflicts of interest to influence the outcomes. Because at the end of the day, it's all about what is your policy goal. And your policy goal here is a public health one. And so therefore, it has to be that the driver of that process are the public health players, and in particular government. And so we have to ensure that we have the conflict of interest policies, but also to the transparency and accountability that our procedures, Maisha referenced weak governance, that our procedures allow for us to support the type of decision making that really allows for the best outcome.
Nicole, again, you've made some very hard-hitting points, and it would be one thing if this was just theoretical and in the air, but we do have some examples within the region. And so, Barbara, I'd like to continue along this thread with you. Can you describe some of the challenges with the Jamaica Standards consultation process arising out of the inclusion of industry?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar, and I'll be happy to share a little bit about the experiences in Jamaica. So, like many other countries, the industry has become a regular and sometimes overpowering actor on public policy decisions, despite the clear conflict of interest, since its profitability really relies on high volume sales of ultra processed food. We have a few examples. Imbalance of stakeholder representation during the decision making, as the industry does have some connections through the government ministries and private sector, unfortunately or fortunately. Lack of transparency in the government relations with the private sector, in addition to the lack of strict regulation. So some of this has been discussed by the previous speakers. We note that although industry should not be involved in the policymaking process, they are in the standards process, and the safeguards become increasingly important. There's also a lack of accountability, where there are no procedures or legislations upheld to hold the industry accountable by challenging and denormalizing their participation in the design, formulation, implementation, and evaluation of food policies. Especially in the case of FOPL, as happened in Jamaica in June 2021, where after a series of meetings, there was an irregular meeting leading to a voting process, which was skewed. And then later in 2023, in order to try to reach consensus, the Ministry of Industry had a meeting with one of the stakeholders group that were at loggerheads, meaning that the votes were opposite. So they've tried to misrepresent existing evidence on the high in octagon labels. And we keep hearing that the industry is in support of FOPL, just not the Black Octagon. Regional coordination on all fronts, where they have been seen using the same strategies, even as far as hosting webinars and conducting their own studies, which we have noted to be significantly flawed, unreliable, and not credible. So that basically summarizes my comments at this time.
Yes, definitely powerful examples. And we know that insertion of industry in an inappropriate fashion in the policy process is only but one of the tactics that industry has used, and it comes directly from the industry playbook. But you ended on a very important tactic, another tactic that has not just been used in this particular health issue or this particular campaign or this region, but has been used in many regions of the world, and that is of industry conducting their own research. And of course, we know in 2021, the Caribbean Private Sector Organization undertook a study to determine the best label for the Caribbean, even though the research, had been done. And Professor Alafia, you were a part of the group of regional stakeholders who criticized the study for a number of reasons, including conflict of interest. Can you explain why this represented a conflict of interest?
Okay, so conflict of interest arises when corporations who market harmful products establish financial relations with research institutions, researchers, or public health organizations. And this jeopardizes the integrity of the scientific research. So, for example, 13% of research articles published in the top 10 most cited nutrition journals in 2018 were backed by the food industry. And of those articles with food industry involvement, 56% reported findings that were favorable to the industry interests. Only 10% of articles without food industry involvement reported findings favorable to the business interests. So this is akin to giving a student their own exam paper to mark, right? You set the student set the exam, the student write the exam, and the student mark the exam. And this is what happens when industry funds research, because research needs to be objective. We need to go in as far as possible with a tabula rasa, clean slate. This is the hypothesis we're testing, and we go through the steps. But you know, if you want to get a certain answer, you can ask a certain question. So for example, in the CPSO study that we were talking about earlier, the objective was to see which label helps consumers make the right decision, the easiest decision. The CPSO study said which label gives the consumer information about how many milligrams of sodium are in a product. These are two different questions. So really, how much milligrams of sodium is a sort of intermediary step that takes you to the fact that this sodium is too high, because you would have to make that connection yourself, this sodium and that number, and is it high, is it low, how many? They try to make things complicated and not to allow people to have a right to information about their food. The people want to know, is this food high in salt? That's all they want to know. They really don't want to know how many milligrams of salt is in it. Is it high in salt? Yes or no? And so they will twist the question to answer the question that they want to get their output. And that is the issue with conflict of interest.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as we go through, we're just seeing that I just want to make it clear to our audience today that these tactics are not new, and they're not original to the Caribbean. Like I said, these tactics have been practiced throughout industry in many other regions. And another key tactic that we talk about is that of the use of corporate social responsibility initiatives and marketing to quote unquote do good and build public favor. Shanique, I wonder, can you share some examples of how the industry is doing this in the Caribbean, especially in the school settings, and the harms that are associated with this practice?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. As I was sitting there, I was actually also realizing that for some reason my backdrop is the opposite direction from everybody else. But definitely in terms of corporate social responsibility, we see this happening quite a lot. I can speak on at least three very specific examples here in Jamaica, where most of our major sporting competitions are, the title sponsors are members of the UPP, members of the fast food industry, members of the manufacturing industry, so to speak, including as well many competitions that we have locally that have to do with educational programs such as like debating and writing competitions. We find are heavily sponsored by members of the industry. And this is one way in which they, they're saying that they're giving back to the schools, they're giving back to the communities, they're giving back to their consumers, so to speak. One thing we also do quite notice extensively is that we find that there's just generally a lack of transparency in some of the processes. We've had an instance at Jamaica Youth Advocacy Network where we went into a school and we were having a conversation with the school principal about filming some content on the school grounds, maybe using the canteen and stuff. And she said, sure, you can use the school grounds, but the canteen is off limits because I don't think the owners of the canteen would like that. When we inquired, we found out, it's a very popular brand here in Jamaica. They possibly wouldn't have wanted us coming in and talking about the food that's there and pushing our agenda for healthier food within our schools. And so we generally find that there is that heavy emphasis on including donations and
contributing to sporting events to, increase their brand loyalty and to also buy into the favor of their consumers. But what we find is that this is inherently very harmful because it is inadvertently promoting unhealthy eating habits. And especially when we think about within the school setting where we're largely dealing with children who, for the most part, cannot make the sort of informed decision based on the information that is provided with them. When they see the splashy, colorful posters and those sort of stuff in the school canteens, they'll gravitate towards that. And so there's an emphasis on the harmful effects of promotion of unhealthy eating habits. And we see how that's playing out in terms of the rise in NCDs, especially amongst adolescents and youth. There's also the undermining of public health efforts. And so you find that just generally it is running counter to what our ministries of health are probably promoting, but we see the industry playing out differently in the schools based on what they're contributing to schools in terms of products or what they're doing in terms of the marketing within the school environment and its environs. And then lastly, there's also just generally a harmful impact and a very real concern about the ethical concern about marketing to children themselves. Because again, while children are very brilliant, at the end of the day, when certain information is being pushed towards them in a very forceful way, they may not be able to make informed choices. And so there's an ethical concern about marketing to children that needs to also be addressed within this context.
Excellent point, Shanique. And I just want to add here, that studies support the fact that when we advertise unhealthy foods to children, that it increases the likelihood of them having or eating unhealthy foods, the foods that we advertise. And so this is grounded in science. It's not just something that we are saying. And we also see corporate social responsibility throughout our society. So it's a very good example of cradle to grave marketing. But one of the other tactics that we've also observed is that industry sometimes will seek to weaken the policy. They'll seek to suggest an alternative. And I just want to bounce back to Alafia because I know that you mentioned this. They're saying, we want other things, but we just don't want the octagonal warning label. I wondered if you could elaborate on the effects of industry seeking to weaken policies in this way.
Yes, thank you very much. And earlier in the conversation, when I was hearing the discussion, what happens is that industry comes with a very friendly appearance, saying, oh, there are 6 or 7 possible interventions. Let's support this one. But what industry strategically does is that they choose the least effective intervention to promote, right? So that is really what is happening where it comes to industry. In relation to the study that was done and the labels and the choice between labels and all that, I think that the issue is that the black octagon is the most effective label. So since they feel that they have to say something about front of package labels, they say, yes, we're willing, but the one you want is not the one we want. So let's do research over the next 10 years to come up with another label that would be good for us. And they're hoping that in the 10 years, we'll drop it and forget about it. But it's a delay, deny, right? That's the tactic. So that's really, what they do. And, as was said before, government has to put on their big boy pants and recognize the issues and taxation, legislation, regulation. We cannot compete with marketing because we spend $10 on marketing. The big companies spend $1,000 on marketing. You can't compete. You have to tax stuff. I want to double the price of French fries, right? And we say to the people, it's a health tax. You're paying down on the heart attack that the French fries is going to cause you in 10 years' time.
Absolutely. I agree. And so we've seen a number of tactics used from insertion into the policy process in an inappropriate way, creating their own research on the side of industry, from corporate social responsibility, and then attempting to weaken policies. These are all tactics that we have observed in the region. But I think at this point, we need to talk about solutions because we know that the effect of all of these things is to create policy inertia. So we need to discuss solutions. How do we get the process going and going in the right direction? We are a small society, and we know that these policies will come at a cost, but the benefits of these policies far outweigh the short-term costs. And so how do we safeguard against this interference in our small island developing state setting? Ms. Foster, I'm going to start with you, Nicole. How can we use regulatory tools such as policy and legislation to address the commercial determinants of health?
Hi, thanks, Kia. Yeah, so as I would have mentioned earlier in my earlier intervention, the idea is to use law to the extent that one can. Certainly front of the conflict of interest policies provide then an opportunity for persons to see what has gone wrong, what has gone right, as the case may be, and potentially challenge that. I mean, we certainly have as well tools such as Freedom of Information Acts. Barbados, unfortunately, does not have one, but several of the territories do, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and we have seen quite liberal interpretations of the application of those pieces of legislation to really, I mean, it's about democracy, right? It's about human rights, it's about access to information, about empowering people, and also getting the benefits of science, which is another human right. And so we have seen in some of those territories openings, options from a legal perspective for you to at least get more information, because sometimes one's hands is very much tied in terms of asking the right questions because you don't know who was in the room, who did what, etc. I just came from a full governance conference in Australia. And I must tell you, Chile is once again leading the pack. We saw an example of a disclosure of a meeting pursuant to their Freedom of Information Act. It was just amazing. Who was in the room, what they taught, I mean, down to who were the assistants that met with the minister in question, etc. And so that just provides a level playing field for us all to know what's going on and what are the potential influences that are being exercised and how we might contain those. And so that's just one very concrete example of how law and policies and regulation and legislation can help. But as I said, we can have soft tools, soft law tools, like more guidelines or conflict of interest policies, because those tools still give you a basis on which to ask very hard questions, very pointed questions, to potentially say, look, we want to go judicial review. We're questioning the legitimacy of this decision. We're questioning whether it's a reasonable decision that has been made here. But to do all of those things, you need the information. And so really tools like the hard law tools now, like Freedom of Information Acts that speak to management of conflict of interest, integrity in public life, all of those types of legal interventions all work together to help us level the playing field and kind of give a spotlight and create transparency and accountability.
Excellent points, Nicole. And you started with a really good example. But what it drives home is the importance of having a whole of government approach. We need all arms of government on deck. We need health in all policies, and of course, policy coherence so that we're all aiming towards a common goal. But these remain major challenges to NCD prevention and control, and often industry entry points into policy making. They're often in non-health ministries. So through multi-sectoral engagement platforms. So Dr. Phillips, what strategies can we deploy to support policy coherence?
Thanks. I think fortunately there are a variety of strategies that we can deploy. I'll highlight a couple of them that I think would be useful in our regional settings. One is just working together better. Ministries of health and civil society players, need to find ways to work better across sectors, across departments, to ensure that the other partners who are involved in making the policy decisions, facilitating the processes, understand what is at stake and understand that there is benefit to having mechanisms for collaboration and mechanisms for looking specifically at the sorts of issues that will come before them. That then potentially leads into issues around, do we have the capacity? Do we have the tools? Do we have the knowledge to navigate dealing with health in all policies? So do we need to build capacity both within health sector and other partners to say, here's how we understand health and all policies, here are some of the challenges, and here are some of the frameworks that we can put in place to say, if this is a large project, if this is a big decision, then there needs to be some explicit acknowledgement of what the health implications are and a clear decision and documentation around that. Health impact assessments can also feed into that. So we're formally saying, okay, here's the decision, here are the potential impacts on health, here are the potential impacts from an economic point of view, etc. But we're formally integrating then the impacts on health. So this is documented, it's acknowledged, it's integrated into the decision making in a more formal and structured way, not just from a Ministry of Health, but from any other partner ministry that may be involved in policies that impact health. Of course, the political leadership is important, and the policymakers have the ability to advance NCD prevention and control, and to advance the supporting mechanisms, including policy coherence. So they can advocate for prioritizing health in policy making and for allocating resources where the evidence indicates that they will be most beneficial. So ultimately, these and other strategies can help us to achieve greater policy coherence, even as we speak about the importance of whole of government and whole of society, given the fact that many of the drivers of NCDs are outside of the normal span of control of a national health authority. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, Barbara, you have worked in tobacco for years, and we are seeing that many of the tactics that are being used by the food industry are straight from the tobacco industry playbook. I've alluded to this a number of times, but what lessons can we learn from tobacco?
Okay, so we know that there's a strong correlation between UPP tactics and the tobacco industry tactics. Of course, as mentioned before, we do need strong conflict of interest policies, especially in our small settings where individuals wear many conflicting hats and the lines between professional and personal are often blurred. And we see that, in the Caribbean. We also need strong civil society support to play the watchdog role, holding governments to account while also supporting them when needed. This is something we did in the Coalition for Tobacco Control. Once we saw something, we called them on it. And in fact, sometimes the tobacco industry actually changed their tactics based on the advocacy that we did. The industry, very similar to tobacco, usually employs an array of strategies to shape, influence, and block programs on health intervention. So Alafia mentioned them earlier, but I want to expand. So the delay would be to push for longer consultation periods, more research and evidence, and threaten litigations and trade actions. Because what I think they know, some of the things that will happen, examples for, front of package labels will happen. But if you could delay it, then that's one of the ways. Divide. They develop and promote their own labels, which are generally less stringent than the government's proposal, often confusing and uninterpretable. That has happened. argue for voluntary labels over mandatory labels, attack, elements of the labels, the choice of format, and so on. And of course, lobbying to stop any regulation such as SSB and FOPL, for which we are very knowledgeable. So deflecting to claim that the warning labels will scare or mislead people, and that the nutrient profile model is too strict or no foods are going to have the label. Claim that industry self-regulation is working, and that one is in tobacco, that was something that they did too, where they said, okay, we will regulate and we will do this and we will voluntarily not do billboards or whatever. But as long as there's not a law in place, tomorrow they can go back to do what they're doing. Reframe the issue to state it negatively impacts businesses or the economy by restriction on trade or job losses in manufacturing and agriculture. And this was mentioned earlier. Reframe the issue to say physical inactivity or individual responsibility is the central issue.
Yep.
In terms of deny, claim that there's not enough evidence to make decisions, cast doubt on existing evidence of effectiveness, argue that there's a lack of agreement globally on the most effective label, fund research and reports that showcase alternative policy options, and discuss the economic impact on consumers and manufacturers. Okay, so finally, the challenges these industries present are commercial determinants of health, which are factors that influence health, which stem from the profit motive. While people can change their lifestyles, many have limited control over their exposure to the activities of certain corporations, such as marketing of unhealthy foods. And that's about it. Thanks.
Yes, I think that's very informative and very clear. And one of the things that you talked about is the role of civil society and being watchdogs. And I wanted to bring Maisha in here. Maisha, I wonder if you could expand on that.
Hi, Kia, thanks. Civil society has a really critical role to play as watchdogs. And what we mean by that is really holding various partners accountable to commitments. And what we've talked quite a bit about so far in the webinar, it's holding governments and holding private sector accountable. But we also have that responsibility within our own community in terms of identifying, preventing, managing, and mitigating conflicts of interest. So for example, civil society organizations can develop their own conflict of interest policies, which really helps us in identifying where those conflicts sit and in what situations we can either prevent them or we can do our best to manage them. You talked earlier about small developing state settings that we live in. Barbara mentioned multiple people wearing conflicting hats. So oftentimes we cannot prevent altogether those conflicts, but we can manage them to a certain degree. We can also work with, as we've been doing, and Arthur mentioned this as well, how can we work with partners within the public sector to build that awareness around conflicts of interest? Oftentimes, individuals or entities, ministries, departments just aren't aware that there are conflicts because this is a way that they've been accustomed to working. We live in a very limited fiscal space, and oftentimes these partners are the only individuals we can rely on for funding. So building that awareness around conflicts of interest, building the awareness around partners who you should and shouldn't work with, identifying other partners who are safe partners to work with. So there's a real potential role for civil society to play almost a brokering role to not only build awareness, but to help navigate through this really, this is a new area for us, but it's an important area as we try to amp up the implementation of these policies, not only within the food space, but as Barbara mentioned, across tobacco, across alcohol, fossil fuels. So this is an important area that we're going to have to start paying really strong attention to if we really want to make movement and overcome the policy inertia you mentioned, Kia, and get some advancement in these policies which prevent NCDs rather than focusing on treatment.
Yes, that's a wealth of information. And indeed, we've talked quite a bit about conflict of interest. Shanique, you would have spoken earlier about the involvement of industry with schools through corporate social responsibility. But one might argue that in our small resource limited settings, it's often challenging to find private sector partners who have no conflicts of interest. Our food companies are often heterogeneous and they carry health harming and health supporting products. We've seen that quite a bit. So what are some of the strategies that we can adopt to manage these challenges?
Yes, definitely. That is definitely the case. And the reality is as you said, it's hard to find otherwise. And so there's a need to maybe identify the ways that we can still deal with the situation as it is, as the case may be, while also make sure that we are promoting healthier eating overall. And one way we can definitely do this is by placing emphasis on different partnership agreements, having a strong reliance on strong conflict of interest elements, as well as ensuring that there's a transparent selection criteria. So we know that many of the industry players, they have their unhealthy products, but they do also have healthier alternatives in some instances. And so there's a need for one to be very clear about what the partnership agreements, especially within the school setting, need to look like, that we are also promoting more the healthier alternatives than the unhealthy items. But then also two, ensuring that we do due diligence in ensuring that we, as stakeholders, as persons who are engaging with members of the industry, in ensuring that their due diligence that relies on strong conflict of interest elements to identify who the factors are and who we want to do business with. What I mean by this is ensuring that we are placing an emphasis on the promotion of the healthier food items that are available and allowing only those within the school environment themselves. And so the marketing needs to be limited within that instance, and only the healthy foods are coming in. And then lastly, there's also just a need to ensure that there is consumer education across the board. We spoke quite a bit about like the need for front of package warning label. And of course, we are promoting the black octagonal label as the best choice. And so when we have even where the unhealthy alternatives are there, where we have labeling to ensure that consumers, especially young consumers, can make informed choices, that is one way in which we are limiting some of that exposure to the unhealthy foods that are available. Thank you.
Great solutions thus far. And I know, Alafia, you would have spoken before about the conflict of interest that exists with research. And so I wonder, what are some of the safeguards that academics can put in place to prevent and manage these conflicts of interest, and of course, to avert the potential negative impacts, such as biased research and reputational risk? I think this is something that's very, very important in our region.
Yes, thank you. We need to make sure that the funding, that we examine where the funding is coming from. It is often very difficult as academics to get funds. And so there may be food companies who are willing to fund your research. There are some people who take it and then try to put the guardrails around it and all of that. But, at the end of the day, who pays the piper determines the song. And even for your own reputation, we need to be very careful about where we take the money from. So some of the thinking is that public health organizations and institutions should take measures to identify, manage, and limit or eliminate conflict of interest caused by partnerships with food companies, and so on. I have the floor. I would like to make one other point, though, which is not, you hadn't raised it, but if you'll allow me. So in terms of looking at front of package warning labels and how to go forward in the Caribbean, I think one of the things that we need to do always is to listen to our enemies or our adversaries, or however we want to describe them. Because no matter how you look at somebody, sometimes they have valid points. So one of the points that has been raised by the food industry in terms of front of package labeling is the fact that because we import so much of our food, and because we are such a small proportion of the manufacturer. So Kellogg's, for example, or whoever, may export 0.1% of their products to the Caribbean. They are not going to put labels on the 0.1% of their products. So it means that in the Caribbean, we would have to stick on labels to most of our products. And I think we need to do a feasibility study to show industry that this is feasible and it has been done elsewhere. Because Maisha and I were talking some time ago, and there is no small island state that has implemented stick-on labels. So we would be the first to actually do that. So the question needs to be, is it feasible? Is it possible? Is it robust? Is it valid? Who is going to validate the labels after they're stuck on? Whose responsibility it is, and so on. And more importantly, can we show industry a country where this has been done? I think it's important for us to do a case study and to show the possibility, because sometimes you have to spoon feed industry. I mean, I'm working right now with industry in Jamaica trying to get trans fat. The legislation is one approach, but also working with industry to coax them and nudge them along the way. And there are things that, we can do to nudge. And I think one of the things we can do with front of package labeling is to look at another country where the stick-on thing has been done and it has been successful. So I just thought I'd throw that in as well. Thank you.
Excellent points raised. Excellent points. And it's a good way to end our discussion. I want to thank our panelists for a robust, information-packed, and more importantly, solution-oriented discussion. And I think it leads very well into our next presentation. We are going to have a sneak peek of the new report, the Public Health Decision Making in CARICOM. And to present that to us is Dr. Isa Barbosa, the Global Center for Legal Innovation on Food and from the Global Center for Legal Innovation on Food Environment Center, the O'Neill Institute for the National and Global Health Law, Georgetown University.
Thank you very much, Kia. I'm very happy to be here alongside such an amazing group of panelists and presenters. Let me just share my screen so I can start my presentation. One moment, please. Can you see? Yes, right? I believe you can. Okay, so I have...
We can see it.
Perfect. Thank you, Maisha. So as Kia was mentioning, I was asked to give a sneak peek of an upcoming report that will be released in March, which is called Public Health Decision Making in CARICOM, Strengthening the Front of Package Nutrition Labeling Standardization Program. And the first thing that I will say about this report is that it is a joint publication from the Global Center for Legal Innovation on Food Environments, jointly with the Healthy Caribbean Coalition and with the University of the West Indies Cave Hill, and in particular, Professor Nicole Foster's unit, which focuses on NCDs and the law. So it really is a product of many minds and many hands, and I have the honor of giving the sneak peek, and later on we can discuss more once it's launched. And I won't talk a lot about the context because some of this has already come up in this webinar. But essentially, it talks about the cross-queue process, which has been revising, as you all know, the CARICOM regional standard specification for the labeling of prepackaged foods to include octagonal high-end warning labels. So I think it was Maisha that mentioned before that in 2021, there was a vote failed to reach the 75% threshold. There was recently another vote in October 2023. We're still waiting for those results, again, as Maisha mentioned in the beginning. So in this context, it really is crucial to strengthen the cross-queue standardization program and to privilege decision-making that is free from conflicts of interest, which includes, of course, science that underpins policymaking, and some of that has also come up in the panel conversation that we just had. And essentially establish good governance mechanisms that can increase transparency, that can foster accountability, and that can ultimately safeguard policymaking from vested interests. Nicole was just mentioning that she was in the Food Governance Conference. I was also there, and Maisha and other colleagues. And it's interesting because a lot of that conference, as we were examining food governance, we ultimately all came to the conclusion that it's about governance, right? It's about broader and beyond food. How can we strengthen those mechanisms that we have available so that we can privilege public health and other important interests for societies in general? And it made me think a lot about this report where we talk about how this relates to labeling, but essentially what we're seeking is to strengthen governance mechanisms that relate to public health. So I can talk a little bit about how the report is structured. I won't get into detail because it's just meant to be a sneak peek. But the first part, essentially it identifies the CARICOM organs, institutions, agencies, and committees that are involved in the cross-queue standardization program. And it discusses their relevance to food labeling and public health. So this is more of a descriptive session. And then it lays the groundwork for that following session, which focuses on the standards process, right? In part 2 of the report, what it does essentially is that it explains the standardization program, outlining how regional standards are developed and implemented. And it also explores and identifies entry points for potential inordinate industry involvement throughout this process. So those are kind of the red flags that might come up throughout the process. And it does something interesting because it brings concrete examples of how these entry points might be embedded in the current governance processes that are in place. I can give you 2 quick examples, but more, of course, will be included in the report itself. But it touches upon, for example, how Cross-Queue Directive 1 mandates that the chairperson or convener of a Cross-Queue technical committee, including working groups, must have an existing role in good reputation in the industry. And so the report contracts that with the legal perspective and legal requirements. And essentially from the legal standpoint, there's only the relevant requirement that interested parties, of course, including industry, be granted the opportunity to comment on draft standards. So what the directive ends up doing is going beyond what the legal requirements would demand from the situation. And then there are other examples also at the national level. So standards legislation that can lead to the national standard bodies boards having close ties to the regulated industries. And it includes examples from Barbados and from Jamaica. And then part 3 of the report outlines some normative considerations and considers whether Cross-Queue standardization program complies with the normative requirements prescribed by the revised Treaty of Chaguarama, so RTC, but also the broader World Trade Organization legal framework. And it brings also some interesting considerations. For example, it discusses how the RTC prescribes also a consumer protection objective for this process, among other objectives. And it also analyzes the development of this program in relation, like I was mentioning before, with the member states' international obligations, specifically, the World Trade Organization and the technical barriers to trade agreement and the Code of Good Practice. And then finally, the report comes to some very concrete recommendations directed at different actors. So as you can see in the slide, there are some directed at CARICOM and CARICOM's secretariat, others directed at Cross-Queue itself. And some of these recommendations focus on labeling specifically, but they're generally, like I was mentioning in the beginning, they're meant to be tools for the strengthening of the governance mechanisms, which will, of course, trickle down to Cross-Queue and the labeling process. But yes, we hope they can be useful, and we're looking forward to the actual launch. And we have a tentative date, I think, of March 21, but we will, of course, be sharing the information and sharing the report as soon as it's out. But yeah, I guess just the sneak peek here, and we remain available to answer any questions. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Issa, for that very interesting a sneak peek as it's been titled. Certainly, we're hoping that this report will attract the attention of the regional policymakers at the very highest level, and we are certainly going to be following up on this further in due course. So if all the panelists now would put on your cameras, and we've now got a period for question and answers. So we've had a lot of interesting questions that have been sent forward in the Q&A and otherwise. And perhaps I'd like to start with an open question and ask the panel, is this a rights issue? I don't seem to have heard much about the rights aspect of this issue. Is this a rights issue? Who's going to take that question?
So maybe I'll start first, so Trevor. So I did make some reference earlier about the human rights, and it absolutely is, right? So the whole engagement in terms of front of pack warning labels, but health more generally, is about realization of the right to health, but also to other rights, because we understand rights as being interconnected and interdependent. And so if we think about front of pack warning labels, for example, what we're talking about is the right to health, the right to life, the right to education, the right to the benefit of science, the right to information, all of those things. And then also the idea that we know that those with NCDs, those who are most vulnerable, are the ones who suffer the most from NCDs or have the worst outcomes. And we saw it certainly in COVID, etc. Those who are most economically vulnerable, etc. And so human rights-based approaches equally put an emphasis on the most vulnerable, on accountability, transparency, and participation. And those are key principles and values that are reflected in the advocacy related to front and pack warning labels, but embedded also in the acts that we have. Over.
Anyone else wishes to respond to that question?
Yes, Trevor, I'd like to make just a brief comment on the question of the rights to information that's appropriate. So part of the whole argument is that, okay, the information about what's in so the nutrition label is on the back of the most products. So the information is there. That's the sort of answer. But the information is not translatable and comprehensible by all in society. And the group in society that has the most burden from non-communicable diseases and that needs these warning labels is the same group that cannot figure out the mathematics on the back of the label. I can't figure out the mathematics on the back of the label, and I'm highly educated. So people are really challenged with this. And I think that the right to information that's appropriate for each individual to make their decision is also another part of this rights-based approach. Thank you.
Isa?
Thank you, Sir Trevor. I just wanted to jump in and complement what my fellow panelists have said before, and just flag that recently we have had some important statements come out at the regional level in the Americas, but also at the UN level, that explicitly talk about front of package warning label as a means to realize human rights. And there's a really interesting statement that came out a couple of years back. And then more recently, a report that was issued by the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, where she also makes that reference. And then in the Americas, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued last year, a few months back, a report on NCDs and human rights that also talks explicitly about this regulatory measure. So I think it's a really key question, because oftentimes from the legal standpoint, we make a very big effort to justify some of these measures under, trade obligations and such. And that is a very important effort. We do need to cross our T's and dot our I's. But it's also important to realize that inaction on the part of governments might also be leading to unfulfillment of human rights obligations that they have taken upon, right? So I think I just wanted to complement what others have said. Thank you.
Any further observations? And how do we get those who are responsible for honoring and ensuring that those rights are recognized and have practical meaning at the national level to do so?
So I'll jump in quickly once again. So I think one of the things that we have seen, certainly for Trevor, as you know, as HCC and CSOs working in this space, is that there's some levers that can be pressed to sort of raise the profile of these issues and provide some pressure, positive pressure to our governments to act. And we've seen that, for example, in the context of the Law and Health Research Unit, HCC, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados have put submissions into the UN processes. So Barbados just went through a universal periodic review of its human rights record, and we made sure to put in a submission as CSOs, drawing attention to some of the good, but also the very much unfinished agenda. And we had some good responses from sometimes some unlikely partners in terms of states, from Asia, etc., really commending us in terms of school nutrition policies, etc., but urging us to do more. Very much in line with what Isa spoke about in terms of these high-level international and regional instruments, reports, and statements that have been coming out from the UN Special Rapporteur, as well as the treaty bodies themselves, both the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, as well as the treaty bodies within the UN. So I think there is scope for CSOs to engage more deeply in that space. It is an unfamiliar space to us, but it's an important space. And governments pay attention. I mean, Barbados had to make a statement at the meeting, etc. And so they will have to engage in some of those issues. I think that's one concrete way in which we can try to push the needle forward. Is incremental steps always. I think it's nothing overnight that magically we're going to get everybody coming on board. But I think all of these things add up and help, and then also build the capacity and the appreciation of the public. Because I think that's also important. Building that human rights culture and sensitivity for persons understanding that it's not about government gets to make all of these calls for you. This is about a right that you're entitled to, and the government needs to do better in terms of realizing it. Over.
Okay, fine. So let's change a bit. This question was in the chat. Do any of the panelists have experience with or know of the implementation and use of health impact assessments as a mechanism for strengthening the multi-sector action? Health impact assessments as it relates to the multi-sector action. The basis of this question, of course, is that it's been well established that the approach to the prevention and control of NCDs should be a multi-sectoral approach. The question therefore asked is whether or not anyone on the panel is aware of any health impact assessments that have been undertaken as far as this approach is concerned. Anyone or know of? Okay, clearly.
Prof.
Yes, go ahead.
If I can, right, so I think we've all said we're not aware. What I can say is that PAHO, as an agency that supports health systems and that has collaborating institutions, has in the past had an effort to promote health impact assessments and to train persons across the wider LAC region. But I'm not aware of countries that are using the method.
Okay, fine. Are there any legal implications of adopting a front of package warning label that has been determined to be not the most effective? In other words, there's some debate, if you will, and I use the word debate advisedly, as to which is the most effective form of front of package warning labeling. And there is a trend or an urge for us in the Caribbean to use a less than international best practice. Isa?
Thank you, Sir Trevor. I can chime in. I don't know if Nicole would like to complement afterwards, but Nicole actually was mentioning just now the rights to benefit from scientific progress. And I think that's an important consideration when we're thinking about the question of the actual design of the front of pack label that will be adopted. And I wanted to go back to what I was saying before about the UN statements on front of package labeling, because it does make that exercise, right? It says that it's not only about adopting front of package nutrition labeling, but what kind of nutrition labeling, and guided by the best scientific evidence that is free from conflicts of interest. And it actually explicitly talks about warning labels and mentions some examples, including the octagonal one and all of the requirements that we have been discussing throughout this webinar. So all of this to say that I think that, you know, in international human rights law, we have been evolving to the point of not only saying that governments must act and must take action, but also how they must do that as informed by the rights framework, including the right to benefit from scientific progress. And it does place a lot of emphasis on the fact that it has to be based on scientific evidence and that it has to be freed from conflicts of interest. So I think to answer your question, Sir Trevor, I do believe that depending on what is adopted and you know the extent from which it moves away from what we know will be most effective, that might have implications. So it's not only about taking action, but also taking specific action.
Good.
Yeah.
And a quick comment, Nicole.
Yeah, so just to complement, ISA is taught from a human rights perspective, just not from an international trade law perspective. So we've talked about this measure as one that is interconnected, right? So it implicates other areas, and a big area is health. It's trade. And what is clear, what is absolutely clear in the WTO regime is we only get a pass in terms of having negative impacts on trade if it is the most effective measure for securing our public health goal, or public health goal, or public policy goal, which here is a public health goal. So from the time that we go an option that is not supported by best science, that does not show that this is the best way of securing this goal, we open ourselves to challenge, legal challenges in a WTO context based on now violating trade rules because we are acting contrary to what we're required to do in the context of, you know, allowing in trade, you know, free trade, etc. So that's also an important consideration. Concretely, it's clearly demonstrated in the jurisprudence of the WTO from 2001 coming right down. Over.
Okay, so let's change gears a bit. And because we've spoken of the role of civil society in a very general sense, but are there others that need to be involved in this exercise? The youth, people living with NCDs, any comments and observations? Because clearly this is an effort that requires virtually all hands on deck. Any comments? Shanique,
Well,
you look as if you want to make a comment.
So no, yes, definitely. I do think that there is value in having young people involved in this process, particularly in the discussions around marketing and around the front of package warning label. Just very briefly, two things I think are worth noting are usually when we do our interventions at JN and we're talking to them about the school nutrition policy, one of the things that we typically ask them is if they know how much sugar is like 24 grams of sugar. And when we explain to them that that 1 teaspoon is roughly 4 grams, and then that translates into 1 little small juice having an entire 6 teaspoons of sugar, it really resonates with them in a way that they cannot understand otherwise, because they're just looking at the bottle and they see 24 grams on the back, and that means nothing to them in a practical sense. And so usually we get quite a reaction out of that, and then they're talking about, oh, that's too much sugar, that's a lot of sugar, and it gets even more complicated when they're having 3 of those juices a day, and so they're way over their sugar limit for the day, that sort of thing. And so I think there is value in ensuring that we are empowering young people to know information that is tangible in a way that they can represent and tell their friends, their peers, their family, because they'll take this information, they'll go out, they'll tell mom and dad when they'll go home, they'll tell their grandparents, they'll tell whatever, etc. But we also focus on ensuring that they have relevant information that can fuel their advocacy in their own spaces, as simple as in their schools, because they're going to go to their school principal and say, that's a lot of sugar that they're selling in this little juice, and the average child is having probably 2-3 of those a day. That's way too much sugar in one day. And so I think there's really a role that young people have that they can play in that sense. But I think too, as well, there's also a need to really emphasize the fact that nowadays NCDs is not an older people problem. When I was a young person, the only persons I knew with NCDs were people my parents' age. And so, but now we know that research is coming out that children as young as 10, even younger, are showing more signs of having hypertension, having high sugar, and those sort of things. And so there it really is a need to ensure that they can use the information that is there for them to also advance their own advocacy, because they are being directly impacted by the issues as we're seeing them.
Yes, go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, one of the points I want to note, and somewhat coming back from my experiences in tobacco control, when you're sharing advocacy or information about health, it needs to be sent many times. We have seen where you would go to a meeting, you discuss it, but it's like after the third or fourth time that people really get it, you know, unless you have great examples like what Shanique has shared. So we need to look at the governments and wherever in civil society to keep doing the public education program wherever we can. If it's even one mother at a time, one child at a time. We are working with some model schools here through the Early Childhood Commission. And I'll just give you an example. The curriculum clearly includes the importance of healthy food. And the mother of a child called the principal and she said, "You need to give me back my money." And she said, "Why?" She said she took her child to a popular fast food that sells chicken. And the little child said, "No, it's not healthy. I don't want it." You know? So that was just such a important anecdote to show that the children can really impact, as Shanique said, you know, through their parents. We've had experiences again in the days of cessation in tobacco control. Most of it is either they have a heart attack or a family member, especially a child, will bring the information and they reassess their situation as regards, you know, tobacco.
Okay. Alafia?
Yes, I think in talking about civil society that we need to make sure that we are trying to address the different components of civil society. So two sort of pots of people that I would like to put on the table are trade unions and faith-based organizations. I think that perhaps we could try to have sort of a very specific approach to both of these organizational settings, because I think that to engage people, you would have to be very specific in your message. So with the trade unions, you would talk about, you know, productivity, healthiness, on the job, so on and so forth. And with the religious, you might talk about the more religious aspects of eating, as your religious Bible or, you know, your appropriate religious instructions would tell you. So I think market segmentation is basically what I'm saying. I think we need to define the different component strata in our public and perhaps design some interventions specific to that particular group. Thank you.
I'm highly supportive of that observation, particularly as it relates to the trade union movement. I think that's a group that we have not been sufficiently strategic in addressing over the life of our efforts. Tammy, I see you've joined. Perhaps are there any other comments that you'd like to make that you'd want to share following your presentation? Any observations?
Yeah, sure. I'm looking at the chat and I'm not sure if we address this question about what can we do to prevent that industry interference on people to the point where they pressure. I guess my question is, are we expecting the industry to pressure governments and other stakeholders, or are we expecting the people to do this? And I think the work that we do with these campaigns, you know, sometimes it might seem repetitive, sometimes it might seem far-fetched, but it really is geared around trying to get the public to buy into this concept and, well, this reality that, you know, these actions ultimately prevent us from implementing policies that are meant to protect our health, are meant to make, you know, healthy choices easier, are meant to create healthy food environments, etc. And so in that light of pressuring the governments, I think that's our responsibilities. And hopefully, you know, campaigns like See the Truth really highlight, you know, how these tactics are are negatively impactful. So, you know, again, we see, okay, yes, I support, you know, front of pack warning label, just not owl. And, you know, maybe to someone who doesn't, you know, fully understand that, it'll be like, oh, but the industry is supportive of this. But when you get into the crux of it, it's like Althea mentioned earlier, they're supportive of something that's not as effective. So then we go all the way through and we implement this, and it doesn't really achieve our goals. Like Nicole would have mentioned, we have to keep our eyes on the goal. And then we wonder why. Well, we have to take it back to that industry interference and, you know, whose interest was at heart. Fundamentally, it should be ours. And I think as a society, we should be placing that kind of pressure on our policymakers, on, you know, the decision makers, to implement things that fundamentally, like I said, prioritize our health. And I think, you know, the industry will fall in line. It happens all the time. Again, we have discussed in this webinar and this forum, you know, ways in which they can be part of the solution. I want to make it clear that our aim is never to alienate them, never to make them feel like the villain, never to make them feel like you are not part of the solution, you are just the problem. Right now, they pose a problem, but they can totally be part of the solution. And I think these kind of conversations are meant to highlight the ways in which are meant to, you know, kind of get them to acknowledge, hey, we have a problem, and also meant to encourage them to be part of the solution. So, yeah.
Excellent, Tammy. I think at this stage, what I'd like to do is invite each panelist to give a 1 minute or even less final statement. I'll start with you, Isa, and go ahead. Thanks, Alafia. So Isa.
Thank you, Sir Trevor. I guess something that has been on my mind listening to this conversation is that there is really a business case, I think, for governments to regulate and to follow, you know, science, because nowadays they are, you know, they have a big financial burden also of dealing with NCD treatment and control. So it's not only about legal obligations or any of that, it's also a business case for governments to take action. And currently, you know, all of these negative externalities associated with these products are being borne by governments and to a certain extent by society as a whole. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about and talking about more as we call upon governments to act. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Alafia?
Yes, I would like to challenge the young people who are on this call to mount effective social media campaigns carrying our messages. I know that the marketing by big food and big industry is all pervasive. They have many different ways now. Now they're doing product placements inside the actual television show or the actual movie. But I think that I have not seen, maybe I'm not on the right social media links or whatever, but I would love to see some young people taking up some of these messages and putting them out on social media to show their fellow young people that marketers are trying to get them to do things that are not in their best interest, and that this is a good way to, let's promote coconut water, let's do the good things. Social media for young people, please, on our side.
Excellent, Alafia. And so for my part, I've been suggesting to the young people that it's time they started to go out and walk in the streets and protest and march and chain themselves to government buildings. On that note, I'll go over to you, Arthur.
Thanks, Prof. I want to acknowledge the fact that industry has in the past and even with some of their current actions found themselves on the right side of health advancing activities that bring them commercial benefit in reformulating products, in removing trans fats, etc. And I am hopeful that industry will look into the future and see that ultimately they will be judged for the positions that they take on these matters in which they are affecting the health of the population for commercial benefit.
Good. Nicole?
Thanks, Sir Trevor. Two quick linked messages. So my main takeaway is the earlier point made by Isa. This is governance. we're addressing this about health, but this benefits everybody. Whether you're a health player or not, strengthening transparency, accountability, management of conflict of interest makes us better from a development point of view, from a rule of law point of view, etc. I also wanted to look to the future a little bit. And Isa talked about the business case for acting in this space. And I just throw out there and leave that Brazil and some others as governments are actually seeking to grasp industry to bear some of these costs, litigating against them as the vectors of disease and saying to them, you caused this problem. We as government shouldn't be the ones footing the whole bill. You need to contribute it. And we've seen it as well in the climate change space. It may be time for us to think about it in the NCD space as well. Over.
Thank you.
I like that.
Thank you. Shanique?
Yes, if I could just pull on my earlier intervention, we are seeing more and more young people, more and more for children who are becoming ill. And so it really signals a need for some strong interventions at this time. Sick children will become sick adults, as the saying goes. And so there's really a need to place emphasis on ensuring that we are giving them the best protection, the best available life that they can have. And so outside of just even the rules that we operate here within our spaces, the government has a stronger duty to ensure that they're protecting our most vulnerable, our children. And so that calls for strong regulations, strong policies. It calls for meaningful action to ensure that our children can have meaningful, well-lived lives. Thank you.
Okay. Barbara?
Okay, I'll be smart and said I'm endorsing everything that everybody said. However, a multi-pronged approach is important. So we work at policy, we work at working in conflict of interest. And something that Alafia said, we need to listen to our clients, we need to listen to our the population, we need to listen to the industry. She made a very important point, because we do know that some of the industry players are not Machiavellian, you know. They're small, they may be interested in trying to reformulate or so on. But this real interest in things about the cost of labeling and the fact that we need to look at another country, maybe as a case study, you know. So I would just say multi-pronged and listen to each of the sectors that we're working with to see that our message is resonating and is worthwhile.
Okay. Tammy, you'd like to make a final statement?
Sure. I think I want to just take a quick step back and say, number one, I think a key message or takeaway is to recognize the importance and need for policy. You know, when we think about things like changing our eating habits, you know, more physical activity, etc., there's always this individual, like, you need to do this and you need to do that. And first and foremost, we need to understand and respect the role of effective policies in creating environments that allow us to do that. So that's number one. Once we establish that, then maybe as a society, we can become agitated when things are happening that prevent those kind of policies from being designed in an effective way, from being implemented and all of that jazz. So I want to also emphasize that there is a role for everyone. We as a society, again, advocate for what we want, you know, become more aware that, hey, I do have this personal responsibility to a certain extent, but, you know, my environment influences my choices a lot. And so what is my government? What is, you know, what are people doing to support me? Our governments, again, have a responsibility to, you know, implement these kind of policies, protect the government, the policy making spaces. And the private sector, again, as we have all, you know, acknowledged, they do have a role and they can positively impact, you know, this space. So again, recognizing the role and the importance of policy, and also recognizing that all of us have a role to play in successful implementation.
So it only remains for me to thank the panelists. You have all been excellent in your contributions. And it's not only just thanking you as panelists, but thanking you for the tremendous role and contribution that you have played over the years and continue to play in this very worthy venture. Forgive me for highlighting, if I may, Tammy on this occasion, since this webinar is titled See the Truth. Tammy has played and continues to play a especially important role in the HCC's efforts as we seek to address this very challenging problem. Once again, thanks and appreciation for the significant roles, both in the past, as I said before, and as panelists. And just a few very brief words of what I've heard. I've heard we need policies, legislation, regulation, good governance, management of conflict of interest, awareness of the commercial determinants of health and the impact and the role that the harmful, unfortunately, private sector plays in policy making in the Caribbean. And finally, what I heard then is our challenge is to bring the private sector into the realm of health, promoting private sector, so that they can join with us to create a condition that allows the policymakers to enact policies and regulations that are helpful and that are healthy. So we're looking to get the health promoting sector to be on our side. And with those notes, I just want to say thanks very much. I see Kia and Maisha. I don't know if you all wish, I think we're, 6 minutes past. I don't know if you all wish to make any concluding statements. Of course, you should feel free to do so. Kia, Maisha?
Just to say that, we all know the importance of health policy. And I'm currently in the UK in London, and I see it all around me, how it has influenced things, sitting on the subway and seeing advertisements for healthy food as opposed to unhealthy food, seeing all the options, the healthier options for food in the supermarkets. So we know that it does have an impact, but we do need that public support to push policy in the right direction. The public, I think, is the most powerful tool that we have to help governments to align. And so I want to encourage all of us, to get persons around us involved in this fight. It is a worthwhile fight, and we will see the impact in years to come.
On that note, thanks very much, everyone. This webinar is now ended. Thank you.